Good morning once again, and welcome to Unity Spiritual Center of Panama City. And a shout out to our online community, a warm welcome to you as well. This morning, we are continuing on our long journey of the 12 powers. When you think about 12 weeks of this study, it's a lot. So good for you for hanging in there, because today is a doozy. Yes, we'll get to that in just a moment. But the study of the 12 powers is a rich and vibrant study of each and every one of the attributes of God that we have within us. They are not things we need to learn about that are from the outer, trying to put them to work in the inner. They are already within, deep within. We are to awaken them, to be aware of them, to be mindful of them. And so Charles Fillmore, in his book, The 12 Powers of Man, was inspired by teachers of his day and earlier than his time to bring these teachings to us. And countless Unity ministers have followed in that tradition to write even more books on the 12 powers. Our study this summer is about focusing on each one of the individual 12 powers, its representative area within the body temple where it resides, and the color that is associated with it. It's not a difficult study, but it requires awareness and a little bit of effort. So you're in for a treat today as we talk about the power of will. But first, let's review from last week. Last week, we talked about the attribute of understanding. Understanding is the ability to know and perceive, to comprehend, and to spiritually see with our intuitive eye, the eye of intuition, the inner teacher. Metaphysically, understanding means God is supreme knowing. That in man which comprehends is understanding. It knows and comprehends in conjunction with wisdom. There are two ways to get spiritual understanding, or understanding in general. We mentioned this last week, but it bears repeating. You can either, one, go blindly ahead, blazing a new trail through the school of hard knocks. How many are graduates? Yeah, we're all classmates there. Or we can turn within through prayer and meditation and seek out spiritual understanding in conjunction with our divine presence. That's the understanding that we're really seeking for and growing into. So our homework last week was to be mindful of how we each were using our spiritual attribute of understanding. With it, did you acknowledge the divinity within yourself? Did you try to move into a deeper place of understanding and knowing your innate divinity? Or did you use the power of understanding to confuse yourself with this whole spiritual being, human experience thing? Because what it appears on the outside is that you're a human being having a spiritual being. And I say no. We in our outer world have such tangible things that it tricks our mind into believing what is truly opposite. That is the human condition. What we get to overcome through faith and all of the 12 powers, to find that place of spiritual understanding. And every week I have invited you to find the area within your personal life to apply these teachings to. We are all on a spiritual summer quest, and I'm hoping that it's awakening something deep within you to expand who you are and how you show up in the world. So before we move on, let me preface that just as the power of imagination is known to be the simplest of the 12 powers to have an understanding of, I will also say that the power or attribute of will is the one with the reputation of being the most confusing. Understanding God's will can be problematic, as our late friend and comedian George Carlin points out.
And here's something else, another problem you might have. Suppose your prayers aren't answered. What do you say? Well, it's God's will. Thy will be done. Fine. But if it's God's will and he's going to do what he wants to anyway, why bother praying in the first place? Seems like a big waste of time to me. Couldn't you just skip the praying part and go right to his will? It's all very confusing.
How many of you feel this way from time to time? That is also part of the human condition. So let me dispel this common confusion and share from a metaphysical and unity and new thought perspective. Will is the ability to choose, to decide, to command, to direct, and to determine. The metaphysical meaning of will from the Revealing Word by Charles Fillmore, co-founder of Unity, is the will is the executive faculty of the mind, the determining factor in man. What man wills or decrees comes to pass in his experience. The will is the center of the mind and body, around which one revolves and all the activities that constitute consciousness. It is the avenue through which the I am expresses its potential. The I am being the name of God. It goes on to say that the will may be said to be the will of man because it is the directive power that determines character formation. When man wills to do the will of God, he exercises his personal will using wisdom, love, and spiritual understanding. It's a use of personal will to live God's will. Still confused, I know, I can tell by your faces. So, the metaphysical meaning of the will of God, listen carefully. God's will is always perfection and all good for all of his children. Perfect health in mind and in body, an abundance of every good thing, including joy, peace, wisdom, and love. Not to mention life, abundant life. He does not will suffering or imperfection in any form. The belief that God wills both good and evil is false. The truth is that God is all good, and only good can come to man from him. If man experiences error or inharmony, he brings them upon himself by his failure to harmonize his thoughts, words, and acts with the Lord or divine law. Remember, metaphysically, the word Lord is universal law, divine law. And so, God's will for us is all good. Now, The metaphysical meaning of personal will, the human ego will. Personal will is the adversary in sense conscious will. It assumes power and considers himself to be the rightful ruler. This erroneous belief relating to personal will is discerned and adjusted through spiritual tools and prayer. This adversary troubles us because we strive to maintain the personal freedom instead of submitting or surrendering to divine guidance. Self-confidence is a virtue when founded on the truth of being our Christ nature. But when it arises from personal ego consciousness, it keeps mankind from its true dominion and power. Whoa. So the ego thinks that it's got this abundance of power and it can do anything that it wills. It can manipulate all things to be under its control. But the truth of it is, if the ego would surrender to the power and will of God, it would be 10 times more powerful, 10 times more dramatic, 10 times more impactful for creating in the world. It's a trick that our mind plays. You see how it's like backwards? That's why it's so confusing. So in Luke chapter 22, verse 42, it reads, "Not my will, but yours be done." Not my will, but yours be done. What does that mean? That means it's about surrender to the divine inspiration in the midst of you. It is about submitting the human personality and ego desires for the higher inspiration of spirit. This particular passage is from the timeline where Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And even though Jesus is under tremendous stress at this time in his life, he turned to God to pray with God and for God's guidance. Regardless of how much stress he was experiencing, he turned to God in prayer. Many people resist surrendering to the power of God. I know I did for many, many years. Sometimes we just argue about it. But I always end up surrendering to the will and the wisdom that I gain through prayer and meditation and intuition. I love that George Carlin would say that an invisible power is just plain spooky. And many people believe that it's an unknowing. It can't be figured out, and it's scary to even believe in God because you can't see God. You can't touch God. But that's living from the flip side of the coin. It's backwards. So going back to the timeline of the scripture, not your will, but my will, but yours be done. When you're reading that Bible story, the outcome itself of Jesus praying in the garden and knowing the end of the story that we all know, people then question, what's the use in prayer? You know? Jesus prayed and he was killed for his religious convictions, for his beliefs. Why should I surrender myself to the inner wisdom of God when the inner wisdom of God could not save Jesus from death? I too will die. Yes. The ego in you, the human energy, the human willfulness will die. More appropriately, it won't die like we perceive death to be, but it will be replaced. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. The human power that we perceive to be more powerful will be replaced with the spiritual power, which is its true and rightful place. We're living all backwards. So when we die to the ego, we are allowing our spiritual self to be the power that we live from. We are replacing our human ego with spiritual understanding and the awareness that our divinity is present. Jesus replaced his ego and personal will with the divine will and oneness. He knew he was one with the Father. He knew that beyond a shadow of doubt. He died for it, or so the story says. You know how I am about story. He, in his awareness, lived from a place of spiritual understanding that he was one with God. Our focus is to look upon our spiritual selves, to live from that aspect of our being instead of the human self. It's hard, I know, because we see the human self all the time. The spirit is that invisible essence within us that propels us on our path. And the human will can be so powerful, we think it's running the show. And we can allow it to run the show. Did that work out well for anyone? Didn't for me. I got into whole boatloads of trouble. We won't go into that today. And so people ask, what is God's will for my life? What is God's will for my life? The very question comes from a belief that there is a God that has a predetermined plan for you, that this God has already made choices, that this God is separate. You know, the God that lives on a cloud with a beard and the throne and the staff and all that kind of stuff. You remember him. The one who punishes. That God. In unity, in new thought, in metaphysics, that is not our God. There is no separation. That line of thinking with the God on the cloud is pure separation. We believe in oneness. Jesus believed in oneness. We are not separate. So going back to our choice, our ability to make choice, it is the ability of will to choose and decide. We each get to decide millions of things in a single day. What color socks to wear? Should they match? Doesn't have to be a rule. So we get to choose if we are going to get our life input from the outer, or if we are going to get our life input from our inner divine connection, from our intuition, from our intuitive teacher, from the inner one, from God. Will, the attribute of will, needs to take its instruction from what we studied last week, spiritual understanding. instead of the other way around. If will works in alignment with spiritual understanding, together they can make decisions that will be the highest and best for not only yourself, but for everybody in your circle of influence and beyond. That will bless our world. Divine design, or perfect pattern, that was spoken about by Plato was to realize our individual destiny. This is God's will. Many people think that God's will is not something they would choose for themselves. That is the problem. They certainly don't believe that God's will is what is defined as God's will in the metaphysical definition, that God's will is always perfection and all good for all of his children, perfect health in mind and in body, and an abundance of all good things, including joy, peace, wisdom, love, life. That's the metaphysical definition of God's will. Is that what you had an understanding of up until this morning? Probably not. So let's take that one step further, because the problem is, even though that is the metaphysical definition of the will of God, this is where the choice parts comes in. Do we believe it? Do we believe that it's even a possibility? Because that is not the God on the cloud that we've been taught, which is such a powerful essence and energy in race consciousness in the world. So the problem is also, can we believe that God's will is nothing but good for us? Take a moment, ask yourself, which one do you believe? Which one have you been living your life from? That God's will is all good for you? Or that God's will includes suffering and hardship? Oh, I hate to answer those kinds of questions for myself, so I know where you're at. But you get to decide, using your spiritual understanding, which one will you choose going forward. The choices of the past can be changed by the choices of today and the choices of tomorrow. God's will for us is to make the very best choice that we can make to express the maximum amount of goodness, of Christ's presence in our world, based on our current level of awareness, which is constantly changing. You are learning and growing and expanding and making new choices every day. You're not the same person you were yesterday or 10 years ago. So what I need you to understand is that this race consciousness belief in suffering is a lie we tell ourselves to remain separate. It is a lie that society tells us to hold down and dim the light. Why do you think he was crucified? You know? Someone walking the earth with that much light, oh, they are labeled the troublemaker. Have you not been labeled the troublemaker? I have. Do you see how much joy I get from that? Yes. Awaken to the light within you. Listen to the still small voice, the intuitive teacher. Follow your heart. that is when we will truly live. L-I-V-E. To live any other way is to live backwards. What is live? Spelled backwards. E-V-I-L. Don't you just love word games? They're so revealing. So do what is yours to do to live your life with spiritual understanding, following God's will for you, which is absolutely nothing but good. Doesn't that sound like a wonderful day to live in light and in goodness? You and I are here to be the light of the world. And if that shows up looking like the troublemaker, fine, have at it. I will be right there beside you. And we together will light the way for others. Many people choose to live in ignorance of the truth of their nature. Jesus said, "You will do all of these things and more." Well, it's been 2,000 plus years and we're still waiting for the "and more" part. Okay, so we need to get up out of the lazy boy and leave the remote on the table and go and do and be the Christ presence in the world. Nothing stands between us and our God except fear. Oh, that pesky fear. So in our meditation time, we take the opportunity to focus on the energy center of will in the center of our brain, which is right below the energy center of understanding. Perfectly placed, because understanding, spiritual understanding, needs to govern will, not the other way around. Also, there is imagination. We need to visualize ourselves being the light of the world first, so that we can go and put our hands and feet to work and be it, do it, live it in the world. See it in your mind. Be it with your body. Do it with your life. That is our assignment. And so a balanced will is the ability to choose, to decide, to command, to lead, and to determine based on divine ideas, universal law, and truth principles. If your will is underdeveloped, it shows up as a person who has difficulty making decisions or seeks all of their answers from an outer source. I would not be able to go shopping with this person because they would drive me crazy. I would have to make all their choices for them. Keep that in mind when you're going on a shopping spree. Can your friend make decisions? And if not, are you willing to? Someone's got to. So if your will is overdeveloped, it shows up as an individual who has to have their own way all the time. This is a person who's stuck in 2-year-old toddler consciousness their whole life. We expect them to grow from the terrible 2s to the treacherous 3s, and then they're over it. Yeah, our parents are laughing. They're living it right now. They come off as obstinate, a my way or the highway lifestyle and kind of person. They pick up their toys and they go home because they're not getting their way. These types of individuals have an overdeveloped sense of will. When we talk about a child who is being willful, it's because they're wanting to be in charge. So the question for each of us becomes, how am I using my spiritual attribute of will? Am I using this gift to know that I can live from a place of spiritual understanding and my Christ consciousness? Or am I using it to give my power away, to be small, to cover my light with a bushel basket? In order to effectively use the power of will, you must surrender to spiritual understanding and the Christ presence within. So we get to breathe into that because, that is probably one of the absolute hardest lessons on the spiritual journey, is to let the outer ego personality go and be replaced and embody the Christ presence. You're all shaking your head, yep. It's not for the faint of heart. So this week, your homework is to look at your life and your activities and your thoughts and your words and your actions and ask yourself, how am I using my spiritual gift of will? Am I using the spiritual gift of will or at all, or am I using the ego-based will? And which one will win? So as I leave you to that joyful thought of that spiritual battle that you will have within yourself, I look forward to seeing some of you on Wednesday evening at Wednesday Exploration to dive into this process and discuss it further on a more personal level. Enjoy the journey, have fun with this week, and namaste.